In the heart of ancient Britain, when the shadow of Rome stretched across the world, one woman dared to stand against an empire. She wasn't born of steel or gods. She was a queen, a mother, a symbol of unbroken will. They took her kingdom, they humiliated her family, and they thought they had silenced her forever. But from her pain rose a storm that would make even the mightiest empire tremble. This is not just history. This is vengeance written in fire. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and join our journey through stories of forgotten heroes, epic battles, and the legends that refuse to die. Because some names fade with time, but others, like Boudica, burn forever. The wind howled across the misty plains of ancient Britain, brushing over endless stretches of forest and marshland. The land was raw, untamed, and wild, much like the people who lived there. Among them ruled a woman unlike any other, Boudica, the proud queen of the Iceni tribe. She was tall, fierce, with hair the color of burning copper that streamed down her back like fire. Her eyes carried both warmth and steel, the gaze of someone born to command and protect. The people did not just follow her, they believed in her, as though the gods themselves had sent her to guard their freedom. Her kingdom was small compared to the vast Roman Empire that loomed across the seas, but her heart carried the strength of 10,000 warriors. The Iceni tribe lived by honor, not gold. Their power lay not in marble palaces, but in unity, the loyalty of their warriors, the pride of their women, and the spirit of their ancestors. They worshipped the old gods, the ones carved into stone and whispered to in the wind, and Boudica was their living symbol of that ancient strength. Her husband, King Prasutagus, ruled beside her, a wise leader who understood the delicate balance between power and peace. Rome, at the height of its empire, had extended its hand in friendship, demanding alliances and tribute. Prasutagus, knowing the danger of defying such might, made peace with the invaders. It was a peace of survival, not of surrender. The Iceni would pay their share but remain free, their lands untouched and their traditions unbroken. To the Romans, Britain was a frontier, a place of barbaric tribes and stubborn warriors. But to Boudica it was sacred soil. Every river, every tree, every hill carried the memory of her ancestors. She would ride through her lands, her chariot slicing through the tall grass, the tribesmen cheering as she passed. She wasn't a queen of gold and silk. She was a queen of fire and earth. Her strength was the kind that came from the land itself, the kind that could not be conquered by walls or swords. Boudica believed in balance, the warrior's duty to fight and the ruler's duty to protect. When her people struggled, she stood among them, not above them. When they feasted, she ate beside them, laughing as freely as any of her warriors. Her leadership was not built on fear, but on love, the rarest and most dangerous kind of power. And because of that, her people would follow her into the mouth of death if she asked them to. Under her reign, the Iceni prospered. Their lands were fertile, their warriors respected, and their children raised to honor both courage and compassion. To outsiders they were seen as wild, painted, loud, and untamed. But to those who lived among them, they were a proud and ancient people, bound by a code that even Rome could not understand. It was not laws that held them together, it was loyalty. But even in those peaceful days, a shadow lingered. The Roman governor's men patrolled nearby territories, collecting tribute and enforcing order. Every year, the empire's grip tightened, inch by inch. They called it civilization, but the tribes knew it for what it was, conquest dressed in silver words. Boudica watched quietly, her mind sharp, her spirit restless. She knew peace with Rome was fragile, a storm waiting to break. At night she would stand before the sacred fires, speaking softly to her gods. She asked them not for wealth or glory, but for strength, strength to protect her people when the time came. In her heart she sensed it was coming. The Romans were not a people who shared. They were a people who took. She had seen it in their eyes, that hunger for control, the same hunger that had devoured lands far greater than hers. Yet even as the threat grew, Boudica did not waver. She taught her daughters the art of war, the language of courage, and the price of freedom. A queen does not beg for peace, she told them one night. She defends it. Her words were not just lessons, they were prophecy. Her daughters would one day witness the fall of everything she built, and the rise of everything she would become. For now, though, peace held thin as glass, beautiful and deceptive. Rome watched her kingdom with its cold, calculating eyes, waiting for a weakness. And Boudica watched back, silent as the storm before lightning strikes. Neither side moved, but both knew that one day they would. The queen of the Iceni had not yet drawn her sword. But when she did, the empire would remember her name forever. The day King Prasutagus died, the skies over the Iceni lands seemed to darken. The wind was heavy and still, as though even the gods held their breath. For years his wisdom had balanced the fragile peace between the Iceni and Rome, but now that balance shattered with his final breath. Boudica stood beside his lifeless body, her hands trembling not from weakness, but from the weight of what she knew would come next. Without his presence, the wolves would descend. In his will, Prasutagus had done what he thought would protect his family. He left half his kingdom to Rome and half to his daughters, hoping to keep the empire's greed at bay. But the Romans understood no language except domination. They saw his will not as a treaty, but as an opportunity. Within days, Roman tax collectors and soldiers arrived at the palace gates, their banners snapping in the cold wind, their eyes already filled with contempt. Boudica met them in the great hall, standing tall and proud in her mourning robes. Her daughters clung to her sides as she demanded the Romans honor her husband's final wishes. The soldiers laughed. To them, a woman speaking of power was an insult. "You have no right." One sneered. "Your king is dead. His land belongs to Caesar now." Their words cut deeper than any sword. Boudica felt something break inside her, not her courage, but her restraint. The Romans did not stop at words. They ransacked her home, taking gold, livestock, and sacred relics. The Iceni warriors who tried to resist were cut down without mercy. The air filled with smoke and screams. Boudica fought like a lioness, but they outnumbered her. She was dragged before the Roman magistrate, her arms bound, her crown torn from her head. The Roman whip cracked across her back again and again until blood ran down her skin like rivers of fire. But she did not scream, not once. Her silence terrified them more than any curse. Then came the unspeakable. Before her eyes, her daughters, the blood of her blood, were violated by Roman soldiers. The ground seemed to shatter beneath her as she watched, powerless to stop them. The cruelty was not just meant to break her body, it was meant to destroy her spirit. The Romans wanted to show her that queens were nothing, that tribes were weak, that resistance was hopeless. But in doing so, they created something far more dangerous than rebellion. They created vengeance. When they finally left her lying broken on the ground, the soldiers thought they had silenced her. But inside her, something ancient awoke, a fire older than Rome, a wrath that carried the strength of generations. She rose slowly, her eyes no longer soft with grief, but blazing with fury. Her daughters stood beside her, shaken but alive. That night, under the cold stars, she made a silent vow to the gods. Rome would pay in blood for every tear they had caused. The next morning her tribe gathered. Word spread quickly. The queen had been dishonored, her family defiled, her people enslaved. The Iceni were furious, but fear still clung to them like smoke. Rome was vast, and they were few. But when Boudica stood before them, her wounds still fresh, her voice cut through their doubt like thunder. "They took everything from me," she said, "and I will take everything from them." Her words were fire, and the fire spread. Tribes that had long been silent began to stir. The Trinovantes, the Cornovii, the Ketuvillani, all had suffered Rome's cruelty. One by one their leaders came to her, drawn by her strength, her rage, her unyielding spirit. What Rome had tried to break became the very force that united the tribes. In the heart of every warrior a new heartbeat began to pound, the rhythm of rebellion. Boudica's pain became prophecy. The Romans had humiliated a queen, but they had also awakened a leader unlike any they had ever faced. The woman they whipped would soon command an army. The daughters they violated would soon ride beside her in battle. The land that Rome had called barbaric would soon burn with the flames of vengeance. In the silence after her vow, the forest seemed to listen. The wind carried her name through the trees, whispering it like a warning to the empire, Boudica. The queen had lost her husband, her peace, and her dignity, but in that loss she found something Rome could never conquer: the will to fight, and the power of a mother's rage. The storm was coming, and when it arrived, even Rome would tremble. The nights that followed the Roman assault were filled with silence, not the silence of peace, but of rage brewing beneath the surface. The Iceni lands, once alive with laughter and trade, now echoed with the cries of the wounded and the whispers of vengeance. Boudica sat before the sacred fire, her back still marked with the scars of Roman whips. Each scar burned like a reminder of her duty, a symbol carved into her flesh by those who thought they could break her spirit. Her daughters, though young, had eyes hardened by trauma. They no longer looked like children, they looked like warriors in waiting. The Romans thought they had ended her rule. They believed no woman could stand after such humiliation. But the fire inside Boudica refused to die. Instead, it grew, consuming her pain and shaping it into purpose. She began visiting the villages of nearby tribes under the cover of night. The air was cold, the moon hidden by clouds, but her voice carried through the darkness. "You've felt their chains," she told them. "You've seen their cruelty. Will you wait until they come for your daughters too?" Her words struck like arrows, piercing hearts that had long been silent. Everywhere she went, she found the same anger: tribes forced to surrender, lands taken, temples burned, elders executed. The Romans called it order, the Britons knew it as slavery, and in every gathering, Boudica's presence ignited something forgotten: hope. Not the soft kind that fades under pressure, but the kind born from fury and grief. Warriors began sharpening their blades again. Mothers whispered prayers to the war gods. Drums that had long been silent began to beat once more in the hills. She gathered the chiefs of allied tribes in a hidden grove, surrounded by ancient stones that their ancestors had worshipped for centuries. The wind roared through the trees, as if the gods themselves had come to witness what would happen there. Boudica stood in the center, her hair wild in the stormlight. "Rome has taken from us everything, our land, our honor, our peace," she said, her voice echoing. "Now we take it back." The chiefs exchanged wary glances, but when they saw the fire in her eyes, hesitation vanished. They knelt before her, not as men kneel before a queen, but as soldiers kneel before destiny. Weapons were forged in secret, melted from farming tools and hidden blades. Blacksmiths worked through the night, their hammers ringing like distant thunder. Women wove banners soaked in ash and blood, symbols of the tribes united under one cause. Children carried messages through forests and marshes, spreading the word Boudica rises. The spirit of rebellion spread faster than Rome could imagine, carried by the whispers of the oppressed. Meanwhile, Roman soldiers stationed in Britain went about their daily patrols, blind to the fury forming around them. They saw no threat, just disorganized tribes, unworthy of attention. They laughed in their camps, mocked the barbarian queen, and boasted of their victories. They had no idea that within days the very soil beneath their feet would be stained with their blood. The gods, it seemed, had grown tired of Roman arrogance. In the heart of the Iceni territory, the final preparations began. Warriors painted their faces with blue woad, ancient markings of courage and death. They gathered around massive bonfires, chanting the old war hymns that had not been heard in generations. Boudica stood among them, her daughters beside her in chariots lined with iron blades. The air shimmered with tension, fear, and fierce devotion. She looked at her people, farmers, hunters, mothers, and elders, and she saw not weakness, but an army. That night, before the first attack, she stood alone on a hill overlooking the Roman road. Her eyes followed the torchlight of a distant outpost. She raised her hands to the sky, the storm clouds swirling above. Gods of our ancestors, she whispered, see my wounds, see my daughters, grant me your fury, and I will grant you vengeance. A bolt of lightning tore through the heavens, striking a nearby tree. The tribes took it as a sign. War had been blessed. As dawn broke, the first sound of hooves thundered across the plains. Hundreds of chariots rolled through the mists, the war cries of thousands echoing through the valleys. At the front rode Boudica, her copper hair streaming like fire, her eyes glowing with divine rage. The tribes had risen, and the empire was about to feel their wrath. The queen who had been whipped would now wield the whip of vengeance. The mother who had been wronged would now become the storm that Rome could not contain. In that moment, the fate of Britain changed forever. The rebellion that began with a broken woman would soon engulf legions, cities, and empires. The Romans had sown cruelty, and now they would reap fire. The queen's vengeance had been set in motion, and nothing, not even the might of Rome, could stop it. The Roman city of Camuloginum stood proud, glittering with stone temples and marble statues, the perfect symbol of Roman arrogance. It was the capital of Roman Britain, a city built over the bones of conquered tribes. To the Romans, it was a beacon of civilization. To Boudica and her people, it was an open wound. The grand temple of Claudius towered above the city, built not to honor the gods, but to remind the Britons of their chains. It was there that Roman soldiers laughed, drank, and mocked the tribes they had enslaved. They never imagined that the storm gathering beyond the forests would soon consume them all. Boudica's army moved like a shadow through the woods. Tens of thousands of warriors from different tribes, united under her banner. The air was thick with the scent of sweat, smoke, and determination. Spears gleamed in the morning light, war drums echoed across the hills, and the sound of horses shook the ground. Every step they took brought them closer to vengeance. The queen rode at the front in her war chariot, her daughters beside her, their faces marked with blue woad. To her warriors, she was no longer just a leader, she was the spirit of their ancestors made flesh. When they reached the outskirts of Camuloginum, Boudica raised her spear high, and a terrifying silence fell over the army. She looked upon the walls of the Roman city, her heart cold and steady. This was the place that symbolized everything Rome had stolen: their freedom, their faith, their pride. "Leave nothing standing," she commanded. "Let them feel the pain they gave us. The order echoed through the ranks like thunder. Then came the roar, 1,000 voices shouting in unison, shaking the heavens. The attack had begun. The Romans inside the city were unprepared. They had heard whispers of rebellion, but dismissed them as tribal noise. When the first wave of Britons stormed through the gates, panic erupted. The Roman soldiers scrambled to form ranks, but there were too few of them. The Iceni broke through like a tide of fire, cutting down everyone in their path. Flames spread across wooden roofs, temples cracked under the heat, and statues of Roman gods fell into rubble. The empire's pride was being devoured by its own arrogance. The temple of Claudius became the final refuge for the survivors. Hundreds of Romans fled inside, barricading the doors, praying to their gods for mercy. Boudica stood outside the temple steps, her voice carrying through the chaos. "You built this temple to your false gods with the hands of my people," she shouted. "Now you will burn in it." Her warriors threw torches through the openings, and soon the temple became a furnace. The screams of the trapped Romans rose into the air, a haunting echo of the cries of the Britons they had once enslaved. By nightfall, the city was gone. Where there had once been marble and order, there was now ash and ruin. The smoke rose so high it turned the sky red. Boudica rode through the burning streets, her chariot wheels crushing the remnants of Roman banners. Her people cheered her name, shouting it into the flames, Boudica, the Avenger, the Queen, the Storm. For the first time in years they felt free. The chains of fear had been shattered. But amid the victory, Boudica did not smile. She looked upon the destruction and saw not triumph, but justice. This was not joy, it was the balance of fate. Rome had brought terror to her home, and she had returned it tenfold. She knew this was only the beginning. The empire would not ignore this insult. They would come back stronger with legions of disciplined soldiers and the fury of Rome itself. But she did not care, for now she had given her people something greater than survival. She had given them purpose. The news of Camulogenum's fall spread like wildfire across Britain. Tribes who had once feared Rome began to rise. Even those who had served the empire in silence now turned their weapons against their oppressors. The rebellion was no longer just an act of vengeance. It had become a movement. Rome's hold on Britain began to tremble, and its governors realized too late that they had awakened something ancient and unstoppable. As the smoke settled, Boudica gathered her warriors and looked to the horizon. Ahead lay Londinium and Verulamium, great Roman cities filled with wealth, arrogance, and soldiers. Each one would fall just as Camulogenum had. We have broken their pride. She told her army, now we break their empire. Her warriors struck their shields in unison, a sound like thunder rolling across the earth. The fire of rebellion burned brighter than ever. That night, beneath the crimson sky, Boudica stood on the ruins of the city she had destroyed. The wind carried the smell of ash and victory. She raised her blood-stained spear toward the stars and swore another vow, that she would not rest until every Roman banner had fallen from her land. The gods had answered her once. Now they would watch her finish what she began. The queen who had once been beaten and broken now stood as the nightmare of an empire. The war for Britain had only just begun. The path to Londinium was littered with the remnants of Roman arrogance. Boudica's army moved like a living storm, tens of thousands of warriors marching as one, their war cries echoing through the forests and valleys. Smoke from the burned city of Camulogenum still stained the sky behind them, a signal to every Briton that the rebellion had begun. Villagers along the way joined her cause, bringing their sons, their weapons, and their fury. The queen, who had been whipped now, led an army so vast that even the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. As they approached Londinium, the heart of Roman trade and control, the city glittered in the distance like a jewel of empire. But Boudica did not see beauty. She saw a fortress of oppression, built with the sweat and blood of her people. Merchants filled the markets, Roman soldiers patrolled the streets, and the governor's palace stood tall and cold. The Romans believed themselves untouchable here, safe behind their walls. They did not yet know that death was coming for them, riding in a chariot with burning hair. The governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, had heard of Boudica's rebellion, but was far away with his legions. He sent word for the civilians to flee Londinium, but many refused. Some thought the rumors exaggerated. Others trusted too much in Rome's power. When Boudica's scouts returned, they told her that the city was undefended. The legions were gone, the time had come. She gathered her warriors at dawn, her daughters beside her, and raised her spear toward the rising sun. "This city stands on the bones of our ancestors," she said, her voice cold and fierce. "We will make the Romans remember what it means to take from us." The attack began with the sound of horns. The tribes poured into Londinium like a flood, their chariots slicing through the Roman streets, their weapons flashing in the morning light. The citizens screamed and scattered. The Roman guards fell quickly, and soon the city was chaos. Flames rose from the wooden buildings, smoke twisted into the sky, and the air filled with the roar of vengeance. Statues of Roman emperors were toppled, mosaics shattered, and temples set ablaze. The conquerors had become the conquered. Boudica rode through the city streets, her chariot splattered with ash and blood. Around her, the tribes unleashed the fury of generations. To them, this was not cruelty, it was balance. Rome had burned their villages, enslaved their families, and mocked their gods. Now they returned the fire. The city that had once stood as the pride of Roman Britain crumbled in hours. Not even the children of the empire were spared the wrath of the people they had oppressed. By midday, Londinium was an inferno. The heat was unbearable, the screams endless. Those who escaped the sword met the flames instead. The temple of Diana collapsed in a roar of smoke and sparks. Roman treasures melted into puddles of gold in the streets. It was as though the gods themselves had descended to wipe away the stain of Roman arrogance. Boudica stood at the heart of the burning city, her eyes reflecting the firelight. This was justice, brutal, raw, and long overdue. When the fighting ceased, there was nothing left but smoke and silence. The once bustling city was now a graveyard of charred stone and blackened corpses. The rebels searched through the ruins for Roman survivors, but there were none left. Londinium had fallen completely. The people of Britain, long humiliated and broken, had taken back their pride in one terrible day. The Queen had avenged not only her family, but every tribe that had suffered under Rome's iron heel. As her warriors rested, Boudica looked to her daughters. Their faces were smeared with soot, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. "This is what they made us," she said quietly. "They taught us cruelty, and now we return it." Her daughters said nothing, but their silence carried the weight of understanding. This was not the end, only another beginning. The Romans would not forgive what had been done here, and she would not forgive what had been done to her. Word of the fall of Londinium spread across the empire like wildfire. Rome trembled. The emperor himself heard of the rebellion and raged in disbelief. How could a barbarian queen destroy two major Roman cities in a matter of weeks? In the streets of Rome, senators whispered her name in fear, Boudica. She had become a symbol of defiance, a living nightmare that haunted the pride of the empire. But far from Rome, on the blood-soaked soil of Britain, Boudica stood watching the last embers of Londinium fade into the horizon. The smell of smoke clung to her hair, the cries of victory echoed in her ears. Yet deep inside, she knew that Rome would come for her. The legions would return, disciplined, relentless, merciless. She had won battles, but the war was not yet over. Still, as the wind carried the ashes of the fallen city into the sky, she whispered to herself, "Let them come. We have already shown them that even queens can burn empires." The path to Londinium was littered with the remnants of Roman arrogance. Boudica's army moved like a living storm, tens of thousands of warriors marching as one, their war cries echoing through the forests and valleys. Smoke from the burned city of Camulogenum still stained the sky behind them, a signal to every Briton that the rebellion had begun. Villagers along the way joined her cause, bringing their sons, their weapons, and their fury. The queen, who had been whipped now, led an army so vast that even the ground seemed to tremble beneath its weight. As they approached Londinium, the heart of Roman trade and control, the city glittered in the distance like a jewel of empire. But Boudica did not see beauty. She saw a fortress of oppression, built with the sweat and blood of her people. Merchants filled the markets, Roman soldiers patrolled the streets, and the governor's palace stood tall and cold. The Romans believed themselves untouchable here, safe behind their walls. They did not yet know that death was coming for them, riding in a chariot with burning hair. The governor of Britain, Suetonius Paulinus, had heard of Boudica's rebellion, but was far away with his legions. He sent word for the civilians to flee Londinium, but many refused. Some thought the rumors exaggerated. Others trusted too much in Rome's power. When Boudica's scouts returned, they told her that the city was undefended. The legions were gone, the time had come. She gathered her warriors at dawn, her daughters beside her, and raised her spear toward the rising sun. "This city stands on the bones of our ancestors," she said, her voice cold and fierce. "We will make the Romans remember what it means to take from us." The attack began with the sound of horns. The tribes poured into Londinium like a flood, their chariots slicing through the Roman streets, their weapons flashing in the morning light. The citizens screamed and scattered, the Roman guards fell quickly, and soon the city was chaos. Flames rose from the wooden buildings, smoke twisted into the sky, and the air filled with the roar of vengeance. Statues of Roman emperors were toppled, mosaics shattered, and temples set ablaze. The conquerors had become the conquered. Boudica rode through the city streets, her chariot splattered with ash and blood. Around her, the tribes unleashed the fury of generations. To them, this was not cruelty, it was balance. Rome had burned their villages, enslaved their families, and mocked their gods. Now they returned the fire. The city that had once stood as the pride of Roman Britain crumbled in hours. Not even the children of the empire were spared the wrath of the people they had oppressed. By midday, Londinium was an inferno. The heat was unbearable, the screams endless. Those who escaped the sword met the flames instead. The temple of Diana collapsed in a roar of smoke and sparks. Roman treasures melted into puddles of gold in the streets. It was as though the gods themselves had descended to wipe away the stain of Roman arrogance. Boudica stood at the heart of the burning city, her eyes reflecting the firelight. This was justice, brutal, raw, and long overdue. When the fighting ceased, there was nothing left but smoke and silence. The once bustling city was now a graveyard of charred stone and blackened corpses. The rebels searched through the ruins for Roman survivors, but there were none left. Londinium had fallen completely. The people of Britain, long humiliated and broken, had taken back their pride in one terrible day. The queen had avenged not only her family, but every tribe that had suffered under Rome's iron heel. As her warriors rested, Boudica looked to her daughters. Their faces were smeared with soot, their eyes heavy with exhaustion. "This is what they made us," she said quietly. "They taught us cruelty, and now we return it." Her daughters said nothing, but their silence carried the weight of understanding. This was not the end, only another beginning. The Romans would not forgive what had been done here, and she would not forgive what had been done to her. Word of the fall of Londinium spread across the empire like wildfire. Rome trembled. The emperor himself heard of the rebellion and raged in disbelief. How could a barbarian queen destroy two major Roman cities in a matter of weeks? In the streets of Rome, senators whispered her name in fear, Boudica. She had become a symbol of defiance, a living nightmare that haunted the pride of the empire. But far from Rome, on the blood-soaked soil of Britain, Boudica stood watching the last embers of Londinium fade into the horizon. The smell of smoke clung to her hair, the cries of victory echoed in her ears. Yet deep inside, she knew that Rome would come for her. The legions would return, disciplined, relentless, merciless. She had won battles, but the war was not yet over. Still, as the wind carried the ashes of the fallen city into the sky, she whispered to herself, "Let them come. We have already shown them that even queens can burn empires." The news of Boudica's destruction swept through Rome like wildfire, carried by trembling messengers and terrified survivors. Emperor Nero himself was said to have panicked when he heard that an entire Roman province was in flames. Cities had fallen, legions had vanished, and a barbarian queen was carving her vengeance into the heart of the empire. In Britain, the Roman governor Suetonius Paulinus rode back with his forces from Mona Island, where he had been slaughtering Druids. His eyes burned with rage and disbelief. He swore that he would crush the rebellion, no matter the cost. The legions began to march, silent, disciplined, and merciless. The storm of Rome was coming. While the Britons celebrated their victories, the Romans prepared their vengeance with cold precision. Suetonius gathered what forces remained: the battle, hardened Legio Roman 14 Gemina, fragments of the Roman 20 Valeria, and reinforcements from nearby garrisons. Though outnumbered, they were professionals, soldiers forged in the fires of conquest. They did not sing, they did not boast, they prepared. They built fortifications, sharpened blades, and drilled relentlessly. Rome was patient. Rome was methodical. And Rome would return. Boudica's army swelled to over 100,000, men, women, elders, and youths all burning with fury. They had crushed Camulogenum, annihilated Londinium, and leveled Verulamium. The people believed the gods themselves walked with their queen. Yet, in their triumph, discipline began to fade. Warriors grew overconfident, intoxicated by victory and vengeance. They carried stolen Roman armor and marched with the arrogance of conquerors, not realizing that Rome's silence was not weakness, it was calculation. The two forces finally met on a narrow plain along a Roman road, surrounded by forests. Suetonius had chosen the ground carefully, tight enough to block the enemy's numbers, high enough to give his archers advantage. His legions formed their deadly formation, shields locked in the perfect wall, spears ready, the red of their cloaks burning in the morning light. They were few compared to Boudica's horde, but their calm precision was terrifying. Behind them, wagons filled with Roman women and supplies stood ready to burn if defeat came. There would be no retreat. Across the field, Boudica stood atop her chariot, her daughters beside her, her hair blazing in the wind. She raised her spear and rode along her ranks, her voice carrying above the noise. "This is not just a battle for our lives, it is for our freedom, our children, and the soul of Britain? Her warriors shouted her name, beating their shields in fury. The ground shook beneath their feet. She pointed her weapon at the Roman lines and screamed one word that tore through the air like thunder: attack! The Britons surged forward, a wave of fury and chaos. Arrows rained down from the Roman lines, slicing through the first ranks of tribesmen. The disciplined legions waited until the horde was close enough. Then the air filled with the hiss of javelins. Thousands of Britons fell before they even touched the Roman shields. Still they came crashing into the wall of steel. The noise was deafening, metal against metal, screams, and the deep, rhythmic chants of the legions as they pushed forward. The Britons fought like wild beasts, but the Romans fought like machines. Boudica watched from her chariot, her heart pounding as her warriors threw themselves against the Roman formation again and again. She saw bravery beyond measure, men climbing over piles of bodies to strike at the enemy, women wielding spears beside their husbands, elders screaming curses at Rome as they died. Yet she also saw the trap. The narrow field prevented her army from surrounding the Romans, and her wagons blocked their retreat. What had seemed a battlefield was a coffin, sealed by Roman strategy. Then came the turning point. Suetonius raised his sword, and the legions advanced in perfect unison. The shield wall began to move forward, crushing the Britons beneath it. The short Roman swords found their mark again and again, stabbing through chaos with mechanical precision. The Iceni and their allies broke ranks, confusion spreading like fire. The cries of victory turned to screams of terror. Boudica shouted for her warriors to stand, to fight, to hold the line, but the sound of panic drowned her voice. The field became a slaughterhouse. There was no mercy. The Romans cut through the fleeing Britons like harvesters through wheat. Chariots overturned, horses screamed, and the air grew thick with smoke and blood. Even the women and children who had followed the army were caught in the massacre. By the time the sun began to set, the ground was carpeted with corpses, tens of thousands dead. Rome had retaken Britain in a single brutal day. From her chariot, Boudica saw the end. The dream of freedom had been drenched in blood. Yet even in defeat, she stood tall, her eyes fierce and unbroken. She would not let Rome parade her through the streets as a trophy. As darkness fell, she rode away from the battlefield with her daughters. Some say she drank poison that night. Others believe she disappeared into the mist, her spirit becoming one with the land she fought for. But one thing was certain: the queen who defied an empire had burned her name into history. Rome had won the war, but Boudica had won immortality. When the fires of battle faded, and the cries of the dying were swallowed by silence, the land of Britain lay scarred and broken. Smoke still curled from the burned wagons and shattered chariots, and the stench of death hung heavy in the air. The Roman legions had left nothing alive that could hold a sword, but somewhere beyond that field of ruin, Boudica lived wounded, hollow, but not yet defeated. Her chariot had carried her away from the massacre, vanishing into the forests that once echoed with the songs of victory. Now only whispers remained. She rode for hours through rain and shadow, her daughters beside her, their faces pale and silent. The fire that once burned in her eyes now flickered like a dying ember. Every tree she passed, every pool of blood she saw on the ground, reminded her of the thousands who had followed her into the jaws of death. The forest offered her no comfort, only the weight of her choices. Her revenge had brought ruin, not freedom. And yet, deep inside, she knew Rome's triumph would never erase what she had done. She had shaken the unshakable. Rumors began to spread across the tribes that Boudica still lived, that she was gathering what remained of her warriors to strike again. The Romans, terrified by her legend, hunted the forests and villages, searching for the queen who refused to die. Every woman with red hair became a target of suspicion, but Boudica was no longer leading armies. She had become something else, a spirit, a symbol, a shadow that haunted the empire that thought itself immortal. In the hidden camps of survivors, her name was spoken like a prayer. Mothers whispered it to their children as they slept, telling them of the queen who had defied Rome and made emperors tremble. Warriors who had fled the final battle swore they had seen her standing on a hill as the sun rose, her chariot burning with ghostly fire. Whether truth or myth, it no longer mattered. Boudica had become more than flesh and blood. She had become an idea that could not be conquered. One night, beneath the pale moon, Boudica sat with her daughters by a stream, the water reflecting the scars on her face. She told them that Rome might claim victory today, but tomorrow always belonged to those who remembered. Empires rise, she said softly, but their fear of the free never fades. Her daughters wept silently beside her. They understood that their mother's war was no longer fought with swords, but with memory. The Romans might bury her body, but they could never bury her story. Days later, as the Romans closed in, she made her final decision. Some say she gathered her daughters and drank poison, choosing death on her own terms rather than the humiliation of Roman captivity. Others say she fell ill, her spirit leaving her body before Rome could touch her again. There are even those who claim she was carried into the mists by the gods themselves, her chariot vanishing into the clouds, her war cry echoing across the heavens. No one knows the truth, but all agree on one thing. The day she vanished, the land seemed to mourn. After her death, the Romans buried her story under silence. They built roads and forts where her people had died, trying to erase her name from history. But legends do not die in silence, they grow louder. In the centuries that followed, poets, storytellers, and warriors spoke of the flame-haired queen who rose against an empire. Her spirit became part of Britain's soul, the pulse of rebellion that never stopped beating beneath foreign rule. For the Romans, victory came with unease. They had won the battle, but not the peace. The people of Britain never fully bent their knees again. Every whisper of resistance, every spark of defiance carried her name. Even the emperors of Rome feared her memory, knowing that her ghost lingered in every storm that crossed the British plains. She was the wound that would never heal, the reminder that Rome's power was not eternal. In time, Boudica's story transformed. She was no longer just a queen or a warrior, she became a symbol of freedom itself. When later generations faced tyranny, they invoked her name. When nations spoke of liberty, they remembered her courage. The Romans had tried to destroy her legacy, but instead they had immortalized it. Her vengeance had outlived her body. Her rage had become a nation's heartbeat. And somewhere in the winds of Britain, when the storms roll across the hills and the thunder cracks like chariots on the march, people still say you can hear her voice, fierce, defiant, unbroken. The queen who fought Rome may have fallen in battle, but her story rides eternal, reminding the world that even the mightiest empire can tremble before the wrath of a mother, a warrior, and a queen who refused to be forgotten. Centuries passed and the world changed. Empires rose and fell. Kingdoms came and went, but the name Boudica refused to fade. Time turned her from a figure of tragedy into a legend of unyielding courage. Historians debated her tactics, poets sang of her fury, and soldiers whispered her name before battle as a prayer for strength. The ashes of her rebellion had long been buried beneath the soil, yet her story still burned, not as a memory of defeat, but as the echo of a spirit that refused to bow. In the Roman records, she was painted as a savage, a barbarian who unleashed chaos upon civilization. But in the songs of the Britons, she was the heartbeat of resistance, the embodiment of everything Rome feared, the will of a free people. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere in between. She had been both fierce and flawed, merciful and merciless. But that was what made her real, not a goddess carved from stone, but a woman forged from pain, rage, and love for her homeland. As the centuries rolled into the Middle Ages, her story resurfaced in whispers carried by bards and storytellers who traveled from village to village. In smoky taverns and royal courts alike, they spoke of the queen who stood against an empire. Her chariot, they said, still thundered across the night sky before great battles, her ghostly form leading the brave and damning the cowards. Children listened with wide eyes, believing that somewhere in the wind her war cry still echoed. In time, her legend became a rallying cry for other revolutions. When the English faced tyranny, when the Scots fought for freedom, when the Irish rose in rebellion, voices invoked Boudica's name. "Remember the queen who fought Rome," they would shout, as if summoning her courage from the depths of history. Her defiance had transcended her era. She was no longer just an Iceni queen. She was the symbol of every soul who dared to stand against oppression. When the Renaissance arrived, scholars began digging into ancient manuscripts, rediscovering her tale in the Latin words of Roman historians like Tacitus and Dio Cassius. But what those men had written in scorn, the people now read with awe. The queen they once mocked had become a symbol of the very virtues the world admired: bravery, honor, and unbreakable will. Artists painted her towering over legions, poets immortalized her in verse, and playwrights gave her new life on the stage. Every generation found in her story a reflection of their own hunger for justice. As the industrial age dawned, Britain itself became an empire, the same kind of empire that had once crushed Boudica. Yet, even then, her image persisted as a reminder of the nation's defiant heart. A statue was raised in her honor beside the Thames, her bronze figure riding a chariot, her daughters by her side, her arm raised in eternal defiance. The same river that had once carried Roman ships now carried her memory, gleaming in the sunlight for all to see. The irony was not lost. The conquerors had become the conquered, at least in legend. To the common people, that statue was more than metal. It was a message. It told them that even in a world ruled by empires, rebellion was never truly dead. Tourists walked by it without knowing her full story. Yet somehow they felt her energy, that fierce, unstoppable will carved into her stance. The bronze may have stood still, but in the hearts of those who looked upon it, the chariot still moved, the wheels still turned, the battle still raged. As the modern age unfolded, her story continued to evolve. Feminists hailed her as a symbol of female power, a queen who fought not only for her people, but for her right to lead in a world dominated by men. Historians called her one of the first national heroes. Filmmakers and writers brought her to life in new ways, dressing her in armor of fire and words of steel. Each retelling, each depiction kept her alive not as a relic of the past, but as a timeless voice of defiance. Even today, her story resonates in every struggle where the powerless rise against the powerful. Whether it's the cry for freedom in a nation's streets or the silent determination of someone refusing to give up, her spirit flickers in the hearts of those who dare to fight back. Boudica's war was not truly lost. It merely changed its battlefield. She taught the world that defeat is temporary, but defiance is eternal. And so, as history marches forward, the legend of the warrior queen still rides beside it, unseen but always present. Her story reminds the world that no empire, no matter how mighty, can ever extinguish the fire of a soul that refuses to kneel. In the winds that sweep across Britain's ancient hills, in the thunder of every revolution, her voice still whispers, fierce, unbroken, unforgettable. Long after the dust of Rome had settled and its empire crumbled into ruins, the spirit of Boudica endured like a shadow cast across time. Her name became a thread woven through the identity of a nation, a reminder that even in chains the heart of the free cannot be subdued. The Romans built walls to mark their dominance, but those stones eventually fell, while her legend only grew stronger. She had become more than a story. She was a warning to conquerors, and a promise to the conquered that freedom, though buried, always finds its voice again. As new rulers came, Saxons, Vikings, Normans each brought their own gods and crowns, yet none could erase her. The people still spoke of the flame-haired queen who had once defied the greatest power on earth. In the whispers of the countryside, she became a guardian spirit, watching over the mist-covered fields of Britain. Farmers swore her ghost rode the storm clouds, her chariot wheels rumbling like thunder before great battles. Her wrath, they said, was a curse to tyrants, and her courage a blessing to the brave. Even as history turned her story into myth, her message remained crystal clear, that oppression, no matter how powerful, always plants the seeds of rebellion. The Romans had called her rebellion madness, the people called it justice. That divide became eternal. For centuries, every uprising, every act of defiance carried a piece of her spirit. She was not just a symbol of vengeance, she was proof that courage could outlive death. When writers and scholars centuries later unearthed her story again, they saw in her not a barbarian, but a woman who dared to fight the unstoppable. They wrote of her not as a figure of destruction, but of dignity, a queen who rose after being humiliated and dared to strike back when the world told her to kneel. In an age when women's voices were silenced, hers thundered from history's depths like a battle cry echoing across time. The Victorians, obsessed with empire, tried to claim her as a symbol of Britain's strength, placing her likeness near the seat of their own power. But Boudica's spirit did not belong to rulers, it belonged to the people. The same empire that tried to use her image for pride was, in essence, the very force she had once fought against. Still, her defiant face beside the River Thames served as a reminder that no empire lasts forever, not even those built in her name. Through wars and revolutions, her image appeared again and again. Soldiers painted her emblem on shields, activists invoked her words, and poets compared her flame to the light of liberty. Each age shaped her story anew, sometimes as a hero, sometimes as a rebel, sometimes as a ghost of vengeance. Yet no version ever stripped her of her power. She remained untamed, as if time itself could not dull her fire. As the modern world grew louder and faster, her story found a new home not in dusty manuscripts, but in screens and voices. Filmmakers portrayed her battles with fierce realism, her pain with raw humanity. Teachers taught her as more than a warrior, as a mother who fought for the right to exist without chains. Artists reimagined her with armor of fire, eyes like burning skies, and the soul of a storm. To every generation, she became what they needed most: hope, fury, and defiance in one. Even now, as the world faces new forms of conquest, digital, political, or cultural, her legend still stands as a mirror. People look at her story and see themselves, those who have been wronged, silenced, or underestimated. Her struggle speaks to them across the centuries, whispering the same message, that revenge is not always destruction, but the reclaiming of one's voice. In that sense, her fight never ended. It simply moved into every heart that refuses to surrender. Historians often ask whether Boudica truly existed as the Romans described her, or if her story was reshaped by myth. But perhaps that question misses the point. Whether queen or legend, what she represented cannot be debated, the defiance of the human spirit. Even if her bones were lost to time, her legacy lives on in every act of resistance, every whisper of rebellion, every moment when someone stands against the impossible. So when storms rise over Britain's fields and lightning streaks across the sky, some still imagine the sound of wheels cutting through the wind, a spectral chariot racing through the heavens. They say it is Boudica, the warrior queen, still riding, still fighting, her fury eternal. Empires fall, kings fade, and monuments crumble, but her name endures, the echo of a queen who refused to be forgotten, whose revenge became legend, and whose spirit became the roar of freedom itself. Centuries after her last battle, Boudica's name continues to ride the winds like an echo that time itself cannot silence. Her war was fought in blood and fire, but her victory came in memory, the kind of triumph that cannot be measured by land or crowns. History remembers conquerors for what they built, but legends like Boudica are remembered for what they refused to surrender. The empire that once called her a savage is now dust beneath the same soil she died defending. Yet her spirit still lingers in every corner of Britain, in every heart that dares to defy oppression. As generations passed, the world began to see her not as a rebel queen, but as a mirror of human strength. She represented the will that rises when everything else falls, the fire that burns in the hearts of the powerless when they face the mighty. Her defiance became a timeless language understood by every nation that has ever struggled under the weight of tyranny. She may have lost her life, but she had won something greater, the right to never be erased. Historians continue to argue about the facts, how large her army was, whether she truly burned London to the ground, or what fate befell her in the end. But the truth of her story does not live in numbers or names. It lives in the pulse of resistance, in that unbreakable human instinct to fight when the world demands silence. That was the true victory of Boudica. She proved that no empire, no matter how mighty, can crush the will of a free people forever. Artists and poets across the centuries turned her pain into art, her fury into song. They imagined her chariot blazing across crimson skies, her daughters standing proud beside her, her enemies trembling beneath the weight of her wrath. Some painted her as a goddess, others as a tragic mother, yet all of them saw the same truth, that she was more than mortal. She was a storm wearing a crown, the kind of storm that doesn't fade when the thunder stops but lingers, humming in the bones of the earth. In schools, children still learn her name, their imaginations filling with images of her wild hair, her burning eyes, and the roar of her warriors. They may not grasp the full weight of her grief or the cruelty that fueled her rage, but they understand her spirit, that refusal to kneel. And perhaps that is what keeps her alive. Every time a young mind hears her story and feels inspired to stand tall against injustice, Boudica lives again. The statue by the Thames gleams in the sunlight, her bronze chariot frozen mid-charge, her daughters forever by her side. Tourists walk past, snapping photos, unaware that beneath their feet once lay the ashes of cities she burned. Yet even without knowing, they sense something in that image, strength, defiance, unyielding grace. It's as if her soul still guards the land, daring the world to forget her, but the world never does. The moment her name is spoken, the air seems to thicken, as though history itself pauses to listen. Boudica's story is no longer just a tale of revenge. It is a lesson in what it means to resist, even when the outcome is hopeless. Her courage does not come from her victories, but from her willingness to fight knowing she might lose. That is the essence of heroism, not triumph, but defiance in the face of certain defeat. The Romans defeated her army, but she defeated their arrogance. They conquered her land, but she conquered their legacy. In their history, she was an enemy. In ours, she is eternal. Even today, her name resonates beyond borders. In protests, in revolutions, in the voices of those demanding justice, her spirit finds new forms. She has become a symbol not bound by gender or nation. She is the voice of every person who refuses to bow to oppression. Her story has crossed centuries because it is not just about Britain or Rome. It is about the eternal war between freedom and control, between defiance and submission. The wind that moves across the British plains still feels ancient, like it remembers her footsteps. When thunder rolls over the hills, some say it sounds like the wheels of her chariot, still charging toward the unseen horizon. Perhaps it's imagination, or perhaps legends never truly die. Maybe her spirit rides forever, not in the sky or the soil, but in every heart that burns with courage. And so, the name Boudica remains not as a whisper from the past, but as a cry that still shakes the present. Her revenge was not just against Rome, but against the idea that the weak must accept their fate. Through her pain, she became immortal. Through her defiance, she became truth. The warrior queen who defied an empire still rides not in chains of history, but in the freedom of memory, eternal, untamed, and unforgotten. Empires fall, kings fade, but the spirit of those who fight for freedom never dies. Boudica's story isn't just about war. It's about courage that refuses to kneel, even when the world stands against you. Her body may have turned to dust, but her defiance became immortal. She fought not for glory, but for justice, and in that fight, she became eternal. If her story moved you, subscribe to the channel, because many more untold legends await. Stories of warriors, rebels, and forgotten kings who changed history with the fire of their will. Remember this, heroes may fall, but legends like Boudica never die.